In the year 215 AD, the Roman Emperor Caracalla stood before a realm stretched thin, its legions demanding payment, its coffers depleted by campaigns and lavish spending. His solution was not to raise taxes or cut expenses, but to declare a new coin, the *antoninianus star. Ostensibly worth 2 denarii, it contained only 1.5 times the silver of a single denarius, representing an immediate, imperceptible theft from every citizen. For decades prior, the silver content of the denarius itself had been in steady decline, from a robust 95% under Augustus to a mere 50% by Trajan's reign. Caracalla's act was merely an acceleration, a desperate attempt to conjure wealth from thin air, marking yet another milestone in a relentless, silent process. Empires do not die randomly. They do not merely fade into obscurity. Instead, they follow a predictable, repeating money cycle, a pattern etched into the bedrock of economic history. And within this cycle, the death of a currency almost invariably precedes the decline of the empire it serves. Today, we will trace this repeating mechanism through 6 distinct instances of currency debasement, revealing the profound and often catastrophic consequences of tampering with the very bedrock of trust. By the end, you will recognize the distinct warning signs, the telltale echoes of a cycle that has brought the mightiest powers to their knees. The journey of an empire often begins with sound money, a currency widely accepted, trusted, and backed by tangible value. For Rome, this was the early denarius, a silver coin that facilitated trade across a vast and growing dominion. For the Byzantine Empire, it was the gold solidus known for its remarkable purity and stability for centuries. This trust, built on predictable value, fuels economic expansion. Investment flows, trade flourishes, and the empire grows, fueled by a reliable medium of exchange. This period can be likened to building a magnificent house on a strong, unshakable foundation. However, the allure of growth, the demands of maintaining an expansive state, and the costs of military might inevitably lead to the second stage, debt-funded expansion. Empires, like individuals, often find it easier to borrow than to save or tax. Rome's vast infrastructure projects and endless military campaigns were increasingly financed by drawing upon future wealth. The Byzantine Empire, facing persistent threats from Sassanid Persia and later the Arab Caliphate, required an ever larger military, straining imperial finances. For a time, this borrowing appears sustainable, even productive. The house grows larger, more impressive, with new wings and grander facades, but the loans taken out to fund these additions steadily accumulate. And here lies the pivot, the moment when the debt becomes too large, when the true cost of imperial ambition can no longer be met through conventional means. This ushers in the third, and most destructive, stage, debasement and money printing. Unable or unwilling to default on debts, raise taxes sufficiently, or cut spending dramatically, rulers throughout history have turned to the printing press, or its ancient equivalent, the clipping of coins, the reduction of precious metal content, or the injection of less valuable metals into the monetary supply. Consider the Roman denarius again. From its initial purity of nearly 95% silver under Augustus, 27 BC, 14 AD, the coin's metallic content began a slow, then rapid, descent. By the reign of Nero, 54 to 68 AD, it contained only about 80% silver. By Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 AD, it was down to 75%. Under Commodus, 180 to 192 AD, it plunged to 70%. Caracalla's introduction of the *antoninianus* with its inherent devaluation was a desperate measure. By 268 AD, under Emperor Gallienus, the denarius contained barely 5% silver, primarily copper with a thin silver wash. This wasn't merely a change in appearance, it was a systematic, deliberate dilution of purchasing power, a hidden tax on every transaction. The state was literally creating money out of thin air, attempting to pay its debts and fund its expenditures with currency of ever-diminishing value. The magnificent house, once built on solid rock, now has its foundation slowly, imperceptibly, being dissolved away. 1,000 years later, the Byzantine solidus, a pillar of stability for nearly 8 centuries, faced its own debasement. From its introduction by Constantine the Great, the solidus maintained an astonishing purity of around 4.5 grams of 24-karat gold. This consistency made it the preferred currency across the Mediterranean and beyond. However, by the 11th century, under emperors like Romanos III, 1028 to 1034 AD, and later Michael IV, 1034 to 1041 AD, financial pressures from constant warfare and internal strife led to a gradual reduction in gold content. By the reign of Alexios I Komnenos, 1081 to 1118 AD, the solidus now often called the nomisma had fallen to perhaps 8 carats of gold, a staggering drop of over 60% from its original purity. This debasement triggered rampant inflation, eroding confidence and destabilizing the Byzantine economy, contributing significantly to its long, slow decline. The house's walls are cracking, and the roof begins to leak. The consequences of such actions are profound and predictable. This brings us to the 4th stage, loss of confidence. As the value of currency erodes, people lose trust in its ability to store wealth or facilitate fair exchange. They seek out alternative stores of value, land, goods, or foreign, sounder currencies. Prices for goods and services begin to soar, as merchants demand more debased currency for the same product. This is hyperinflation, a visible symptom of a deeper crisis of trust. We see this starkly in the Spanish Empire's experience with silver. After the discovery of vast silver mines in the New World, particularly Potosi in Bolivia, a flood of silver poured into Spain from the 16th century onward. This influx, rather than making Spain perpetually wealthy, contributed to a phenomenon known as the price revolution. While not a debasement of the coinage itself in the traditional sense, the sudden, massive expansion of the money supply relative to goods and services had a similar effect to debasement. Prices across Spain and Europe rose dramatically over a century, by some estimates 4 to 6 times. Spain, flush with silver, consumed more than it produced, borrowed heavily against future silver shipments, and ultimately found its economic competitiveness crippled by soaring domestic prices. This abundance of silver debased the purchasing power of the existing currency just as surely as clipping coins. Confidence in the long-term stability of prices vanished, and economic activity became increasingly distorted. The very foundations of the house are sinking into the marsh. Which empire do you think we are most like right now? Tell me below. The loss of confidence in domestic currency naturally leads to the 5th stage, reserve currency decline. When an empire's currency is the dominant medium for international trade and finance, its debasement has global repercussions. Other nations begin to question its reliability, seeking alternatives for their reserves and trade settlements. The once mighty British pound sterling, for centuries the world's preeminent reserve currency, gradually ceded its position to the US dollar in the aftermath of 2 world wars. The strain of financing these conflicts, coupled with the dismantling of the gold standard, led to periods of significant inflation and devaluation. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 pegged major currencies to the dollar, and the dollar itself to gold at $35 an ounce, initially reinforcing its position. However, persistent U.S. balance of payment deficits and the cost of the Vietnam War led to increasing pressure on the gold peg. Foreign nations holding vast amounts of dollars began demanding gold in exchange, depleting U.S. reserves. Finally, in 1971, President Nixon unilaterally closed the gold window, ending the dollar's convertibility to gold. This severing of the last link to a tangible asset, while framed as a temporary measure, effectively debased the dollar in the eyes of many, accelerating its transformation into a purely fiat currency and initiating a new era of floating exchange rates. While the dollar remained dominant due to geopolitical and economic power, the underlying mechanism of its value had fundamentally shifted. The once unshakable house now relies on a credit line from an increasingly skeptical world. The final stage of this cycle is collapse and reset. For Rome, this meant centuries of political instability, economic contraction, and ultimately, the fragmentation of the Western Empire. For Byzantium, it was a protracted decline culminating in the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The reset often involves the emergence of a new monetary system, perhaps backed by a different commodity, or a new currency altogether, usually born from the ashes of the old, with a renewed promise of stability. Every empire, every generation, has believed itself to be the exception to these rules. They argue that their unique circumstances, their technological prowess, their geopolitical strength, or the sheer size of their economy somehow insulate them from the immutable laws of economics. This belief, however, is not a shield, it is precisely the symptom of the problem. It is the comfortable delusion that permits the cycle to repeat, justifying ever larger debts and ever more creative forms of monetary expansion. The mechanisms are universal: human incentives, the lure of immediate gratification, the political impossibility of painful but necessary cuts, and the fundamental physics of value. How, then, do we read the warning signs? It is not through stock market tickers or daily news headlines, but by understanding the underlying mechanics. Look for persistent, growing sovereign debt relative to economic output. Observe consistent, unbacked monetary expansion by central authorities. Notice the gradual erosion of purchasing power over time, often masked by official inflation statistics. These are the cracks in the foundation, the subtle tremors that precede the great quakes. The ledger, whether carved in stone, printed on paper, or coded in silicon, always holds the truth. Confidence, once lost, is the hardest asset to rebuild. History does not repeat, but the money rhymes. Subscribe for the patterns that outlast every empire, and tell me below which collapse you want decoded next.